The alarm screamed through the salvage vessel Wayfarer, and Marcus Webb jerked awake in his captain's chair, his coffee spilling across the console in a brown cascade that he'd regret cleaning later, but right now didn't matter because that sound meant credits or danger, and sometimes both at once. "Captain, we've got a distress beacon," Sarah Chun called from the communications station, and her voice had that edge it always got when something didn't add up right. "It's Zitharian," Marcus felt. His chest tightened because Zitharian meant trouble, and trouble meant the kind that could get a small salvage crew killed or worse in these border regions where 3 months ago a human mining outpost had simply vanished, and everyone knew the insectoid. Aliens were responsible, even if nobody could prove it. "How far?" he asked. 2 hours at current speed," Sarah replied, and she was already pulling up the signature analysis. "Marcus, this is weird though. It's a royal transport signature." The bridge went quiet because royal meant important, and important meant the kind of political mess that salvagers were supposed to avoid like a plague ship, but Marcus had never been good at walking away from distress. Calls even when his accountant brain screamed that it was stupid. "Plot a course," he said, and ignored the look his first mate Raymond gave him from the navigation console. "We're checking it out." The Wayfarer wasn't much to look at. A beaten-up cargo hauler that Marcus had converted for salvage work after his tour in the merchant fleet ended badly. But she had good sensors and better shields, which mattered more than pretty paint when you worked the spaces where human and alien territories blurred into contested nothing too. Hours later, they found the wreckage. The Zitharian transport hung in space like a broken jewel, and its hull was split open in 3 places from what looked like weapons fire, but old weapons fire. Because the scorch marks had that particular darkness that came from exposure to unfiltered starlight for months or maybe years. "Life signs?" Marcus asked. Sarah shook her head, then paused and leaned closer to her screen with a frown creasing her forehead in that way that meant she'd found something impossible. "Wait. I'm getting something, but it's faint and weird, like hibernation maybe?" Marcus grabbed his environment suit from the locker behind his chair and started sealing it up despite Raymond's protest that they should call it in to the authorities first and let them handle whatever political mess was waiting in that wreck. "By the time authorities get here, whatever's alive in there will be dead," Marcus said, and his voice came out harder than he meant. But he'd seen too many people die waiting for proper procedures. "I'm going in. You two stay here and keep the engines hot." The EVA across to the wreck took 15 minutes, and every second of it. Marcus expected Zitharian warships to decloak and turn him into floating debris, but space stayed empty and quiet except for his own breathing harsh in his helmet inside the transport. The emergency lighting flickered in patterns that hurt his human eyes, and the air had that particular cold that meant life support had failed a long time ago. But something was still drawing power because he could hear a rhythmic humming from deeper in the ship. He followed the sound through twisted corridors where the walls showed blast scoring and what looked like claw marks from some desperate fight, and tried not to think about what had happened here or who had died screaming in the dark. The humming led him to what his suit's translator labeled as a royal nursery, and that made his stomach drop. Because nursery meant children, and children in a wreck like this meant tragedy too. Stasis pods sat in the center of the room, and they were still active, but barely, because the power readings on their displays showed red across every metric and the small forms inside them looked too still. Marcus moved closer, and his breath caught inside. The pods were 2 Zitharian larvae, and even he could tell they were young from the soft translucence of their carapaces and the way their small mandibles trembled even in stasis. But what made his hand shake as he checked the pod readings was the distinctive bioluminescent patterns along their bodies that his suit helpfully identified as royal bloodline markers. These were someone important's children. The pods were failing, and the readouts told a story of slow degradation over months. where backup power had stretched itself thin, trying to keep two small lives frozen in time while the rest of the ship died around them. Marcus made a decision that he knew was probably stupid and definitely dangerous. Sarah prepped the medical bay. He said into his "I'm bringing them back." "Bringing what back?" Sarah's voice crackled with static. "Two Zitharian royal larvae in failing stasis pods." The silence that followed was so long Marcus thought he'd lost the connection. "Marcus, that's insane," Raymond finally said. "Do you know what kind of political nightmare we're looking at? The Zitharians will think we kidnapped them or worse." "They're dying," Marcus said simply. "I'm not leaving children to die in the dark." He spent the next hour carefully disconnecting the pods and maneuvering them back to the wafer, and all the while his mind raced through the implications. Because whoever these larvae belonged to had been searching for them, and the fact that a royal transport was drifting in dead space meant something had gone very wrong back on the Wayfarer. Sarah and their medic Jack worked frantically to stabilize the pods, but Jack's face got grimmer with each passing minute. "I don't know Zitharian biology well enough," Jack admitted, and his hands moved over alien controls that didn't make sense. "The stasis is failing, and I can't stop it, but if we bring them out, they'll die because I have no idea what they need." Marcus stared at the small forms in the pods and watched their distress through the transparent material as their bodies began to twitch, and their mandibles clicked weakly. "The ship's database," he said suddenly. "Pull everything we have on Zitharian biology. Warfare history. Anything that mentions they're young." What they found was sparse because Zitharians didn't share much about their reproduction, but there were fragments from old contact reports and xenobiology studies that painted a picture royal. Larvae needed constant warmth after emerging from stasis, and they required a steady biosignature to orient themselves and calm their systems, or else they went into shock and died. "We need an incubator," Sarah said. "We don't have Zitharian incubators." Jack replied. Marcus looked at his own chest and remembered something from years ago, when he'd helped deliver supplies to a human colony where a mother had kept her premature infant alive by holding it against her skin for 3 days until proper medical help arrived. "What about a human biosignature?" he asked. Jack stared at him like he'd suggested flying into a star. "That's completely untested and probably won't work, but it might," Marcus said. "And might is better than watching them die." The larvae emerged from failing stasis 20 minutes later, and their small bodies trembled with cold and fear as Jack carefully wrapped them in thermal blankets, but they kept making distressed clicking sounds that got louder and more panicked. Marcus opened his shirt and nodded to Jack, who placed the larvae against his bare chest with shaking hands. The effect was immediate. The clicking softened and the larvae's trembling eased as they pressed themselves against Marcus's warmth, and his heartbeat seemed to calm something primal in them because their small forms relaxed and their mandibles stopped chattering. Marcus stood very still with 2 alien royal children nestled against his skin and wondered what he'd just gotten himself into. 3 days had passed since Marcus Webb had made the probably stupidest decision of his life, and those 3 days had been a crash course in things. He never expected to learn like how Zitharian larvae made soft chirping sounds when they were content, and how they absolutely refused to stay calm unless they could feel his heartbeat against their small bodies. Jack had tried everything to create an alternative, because having your captain walking around with 2 alien royal children strapped to his chest was not exactly standard operating procedure. But every time they attempted to move the larvae to any kind of artificial incubator, the clicking distress sounds started immediately and didn't stop until Marcus held them again. "It's your biosignature," Jack explained for the 5th time while checking the larvae's vital signs, which were surprisingly stable considering the circumstances. "Something about your specific heartbeat rhythm and body temperature matches what they need. And I have no idea why." Marcus adjusted the makeshift wrap he'd fashioned from spare medical fabric and felt one of the larvae shift. against his ribs with a sleepy chirp that he was starting to recognize as their version of contentment. So what? You're saying is I'm stuck like this until we figure out an alternative or until we get them to someone who actually knows. Zitharian biology, yes, Jack said, which brings us to the bigger problem. The bigger problem was sitting in the conference room where Raymond and Sarah had assembled every scrap of intelligence they could find about the missing Zitharian royal offspring, and the picture it painted was deeply concerning. 3 cycles ago, which is about 8 months in human time, Queen Zothran S transport was attacked by unknown forces. Sarah read from her datapad. Her 2 daughters were presumed killed when the ship vanished, and the Queen has been hunting for answers ever since. How important are these daughters? Marcus asked while one of the larvae wrapped a tiny appendage around his finger in what he hoped was affection and not the beginning of some kind of aggressive behavior. Important enough that the Queen executed 17 of her own advisors for failing to protect them, Raymond said grimly. The Zitharians take royal bloodlines seriously, and from what I'm reading, these aren't just any offspring. They're direct heirs to one of the largest Zitharian hive states. Marcus felt the weight of that information settle over him like a heavy blanket, because he'd known these children were important, but execution level important was a different category entirely. So what are options? The Astroman leaned back in his chair with the expression of someone about to suggest something unpleasant. We could ransom them and name our price because the Queen would pay anything. No, Marcus said immediately. We could turn them over to human authorities and let them handle the diplomatic mess. Sarah offered. Might even get a commendation and watch them get used as political bargaining chips while people argue over proper procedures for months. Also, no. Then what do you want to do, Captain? Raymond asked, and there was something careful in his voice, because keeping them isn't exactly an option either. Marcus looked down at the 2 small forms nestled against his chest and watched their peaceful breathing and felt their tiny heartbeats against his skin like butterfly wings. We return them to their mother, he said, directly with no intermediaries and no political games. We just give them back. The silence that followed was broken by Sarah's incredulous laugh. Marcus, the Zitharians will kill us on sight for having royal larvae, she said. Their culture doesn't understand the concept of altruistic rescue, and they'll assume we kidnapped them or worse. Then we'll have to make them understand. What followed were 2 weeks of the strangest routine Marcus had ever experienced, where he ran a salvage ship while carrying 2 increasingly active Zitharian larvae who seemed to think he was their parent and acted accordingly. The larvae, whom he'd started calling Pip and Squeak because he had to call them something, grew stronger each day, and with that strength came personality, because Pip was bold and curious and constantly trying to climb up to his shoulder, while Squeak was quieter but more affectionate and liked to nestle under his chin when she slept. You're getting attached, Jack observed one evening while checking the larvae's development. That's dangerous. I know, Marcus admitted, because he did know, and he was trying very hard not to think about the moment when he'd have to give them back to a mother they didn't remember and leave them in a culture that was completely alien to everything they'd learned to trust in these crucial early days. Larvae had started responding to his voice, and they got excited when he entered a room and made distressed sounds. When he left for more than a few minutes, and it was becoming increasingly obvious that he wasn't just keeping them alive anymore, he was raising them. Sarah found him in the middle of the night cycle, humming softly to the larvae, who couldn't sleep because Squeak was having some kind of nightmare that manifested in rapid mandible clicking and distressed chirps. Is that a lullaby? Sarah asked. Ship database had some Zitharian songs listed under cultural files. Marcus said quietly, I figured it might help. You're humming Zitharian lullabies to alien babies at 3 in the morning. When you say it like that, it sounds weird. Marcus, it is weird, Sarah said, but her voice was gentle. But it's also kind of beautiful in a strange way. The beautiful, strange moment shattered 2 days later when the Wayfarer's proximity. Alarms screamed, and his Etherian patrol ship to cloak directly in their path. Marcus rushed to the bridge with the larvae still strapped to his chest because removing them would take too long and they'd just scream anyway, and found Raymond already trying to establish communications. Attention, human vessel. The Zitharian commander's voice translated through their system in harsh clicks and buzzes. You will power down your engines and prepare to be boarded. This is Captain Marcus Webb of the salvage vessel Wayfarer, Marcus replied, and tried to keep his voice steady. We are carrying precious cargo that we recovered from a derelict transport, and we request safe passage to return it to its rightful owners. You will surrender immediately, or be destroyed. The larvae stirred against Marcus's chest, and Pip made a questioning chirp that he'd learned meant she was picking up on his stress. We have the missing daughters of Queen Zothran aboard, Marcus said, and felt the words drop like bombs. They are alive and healthy, and we wish to return them. The silence that followed lasted approximately 3 seconds. You lie, the commander said. The royal offspring are dead. I'm not lying, and I can prove it, Marcus said. But you need to guarantee our safety first. You are in no position to make demands human. Marcus looked down at Pip and Squeak, who were both awake now and staring up at him with their large compound eyes that reflected the bridge lights in rainbow patterns. I have 2 children on this ship who need their mother, he said quietly, and I will do whatever it takes to get them home safely, so yes, I am making demands. What followed were 6 hours of tense negotiations where the Zitharian patrol ship kept weapons locked on the Wayfarer while Marcus transmitted medical scans and DNA samples, and finally a video feed showing the larvae nestled peacefully against his chest. The commander's reaction to seeing the royal offspring alive was immediate and intense. How did you acquire them? The voice demanded. We found their stasis pods failing in the wreckage of their transport, and we saved them, Marcus explained. That's all this is. A rescue and a return. Humans do not rescue Zitharian young, while this one does. The patrol ship's commander went silent for a long time, and Marcus could imagine the frantic communications happening behind the scenes as word spread up the chain of command that the impossible had happened when the commander spoke again. The voice was different and harder and more dangerous. You will follow our ship to rendezvous coordinates, and you will surrender the royal offspring to proper authority. Agreed, Marcus said, but I want guarantees of safety for my crew. You are in no position. I am in every position, Marcus interrupted, because those coordinates could be an ambush, and these children trust me. And if anything happens to my crew, I promise they will be very upset. It was probably the weakest negotiating position in history, but something in Marcus's voice must have conveyed that he absolutely meant it. You have our word that no harm will come to your crew if you cooperate fully. Marcus wanted to believe that Zitharian honor meant something, but he also knew that different cultures had very different ideas about promises made to outsiders. Still, he didn't have much choice. Set course for the rendezvous, he told Raymond, and everyone. Get some rest while you can. That night Marcus sat in his quarters with Pip and Squeak curled against his chest, and wondered if he was about to make the second stupidest decision of his life by walking into a meeting with aliens who might kill him for the crime of touching their royalty. Squeak chirped softly in her sleep, and Pip's small appendage tightened around his finger. I'll keep you safe, Marcus whispered to them. I promise. He just hoped it was a promise he could actually keep. The Zitharian flagship emerged from faster-than-light travel, like a nightmare made of metal and chitin, and Marcus Webb felt his mouth go dry at the sheer size of it, because the ship was easily 50 times larger than the Wayfarer and bristling with enough weapons to turn a small moon into debris. That's the Royal Command Ship, Sarah whispered from the communications station, and her hands trembled slightly on the controls. Marcus, that's Queen Zothran herself. Marcus adjusted the wrap, holding Pip and Squeak against his chest, and tried to ignore the way. His heart was hammering because the larvae could feel his stress, and they were starting to make concerned chirping sounds. "Well," he said with a calm he absolutely did not feel, "I guess we rated a personal visit." The Zitharian patrol commander's voice crackled through their communications. "Human vessel, you will dock with the royal ship, and Captain Webb will board immediately with the royal offspring, and you will come." Alone, Raymond started to protest, but Marcus cut him off with a sharp gesture. "Agreed," Marcus said. "Preparing to dock now." "This is suicide," Raymond said flatly once the comm channel closed. "You realize they're probably going to kill you the moment you step aboard." "Maybe," Marcus admitted. "But what choice do we have?" Sarah turned from her station with tears in her eyes. "We could run or fight and get everyone killed?" Marcus shook his head. "No, this is the only play we have." Jack appeared with a medical scanner and ran it over the larvae one final time. "Their vitals are good and they're healthy. And if the Queen has any sense, you see that you saved them. The Queen just lost her children for 8 months and then found out a human had them," Marcus said quietly. "I'm not counting on sense winning over emotion." The docking procedure took 20 minutes, and every second of it Marcus expected weapons fire or some kind of trap, but the Zitharian ship simply waited with alien patience. When the airlock finally cycled open, Marcus stepped through into a corridor that was clearly designed for beings much larger than humans. And the temperature hit him immediately because Zitharians liked it hot, and the air felt like walking into a wall of humidity. 4 Zitharian warriors waited for him, and they were massive creatures of armored carapace and razor-sharp limbs, and their compound eyes tracked his every movement with an intensity that made his skin crawl. "Follow one," of them said in translated clicks. They led him through corridors of living metal and bioluminescent panels that pulsed with light, in patterns that hurt his human eyes to watch, and everywhere he looked, he saw more warriors and attendants who stopped whatever they were doing to stare at the human carrying royal offspring. The larvae stirred against his chest, and Pip made a questioning sound while Squeak pressed herself tighter against his ribs in what he recognized as her fear response. "It's okay," Marcus whispered. "We're going to see your mama." The throne room was vast and organic looking, like the inside of some great beast, and at its center on a raised platform sat Queen Zothran herself. She was larger than the warriors by half again, and her carapace showed patterns of age and battle scars, and her eyes were ancient and angry. And when she looked at Marcus, he felt the weight of that gaze like a physical thing. "You," she said, and her voice through the translator was cold enough to freeze stars. "You dare to bring our daughters here after stealing them." "I didn't steal them, Your Majesty," Marcus said, and kept his voice respectful but firm. "I found them dying in the wreckage of your transport, and I saved their lives." "Humans do not save Zitharian young," the Queen said. "Humans are individualistic creatures who care only for themselves and their own genetic lines. So you will tell us the truth about why you took our daughters, or you will die screaming." Marcus felt anger flash through him because he'd risked everything to save these children, and now he was being accused of kidnapping. But he forced the anger down because losing his temper would get him killed. "I saved them because they were dying," he said simply. "Because I heard their distress beacon, and I went to investigate, and I found 2 children in failing stasis pods, and I made the choice that any decent person would make." "Decent," the Queen repeated, and something in her voice suggested she found the word amusing. "You speak of decency while holding our children hostage." "I'm not holding them hostage," Marcus protested. "I brought them here to return them to you. Then give them to us now." Marcus started to move forward, but Pip suddenly chirped loudly and began climbing up toward his shoulder in agitation, while Squeak made distressed clicking sounds that echoed through the throne room. Queen went very still. "What have you done to them?" "She demanded nothing," Marcus said quickly. They're Just upset because they can sense everyone's emotions and there's a lot of tension in this room. He tried to soothe the larvae by humming softly one of the Zitharian lullabies he'd learned, and the effect on the court was electric because every Zitharian present went completely silent, and even the queen seemed to freeze. "Where did you learn that song?" she asked. "Your ship's cultural database," Marcus admitted. The larvae had trouble sleeping sometimes and music seemed to help. "You sang our songs to our daughters. I did whatever I needed to keep them alive and calm," Marcus said. "Look, I know this situation is strange, and I know you have no reason to trust me, but please just let me give them to you so they can be with their mother, where they belong." The queen gestured, and 2 attendants approached with what looked like a specialized carrying container lined with soft material and temperature controls. "Place them in the container," the queen commanded. Marcus carefully began unwrapping the larvae from his chest, but the moment he tried to dip into the container, she began making loud, distressed chirps and reached back toward him with her small appendages. Squeak was worse because she clung to his shirt and refused to let go and made sounds that were honestly heartbreaking. "They don't want to leave you?" one of the court advisors said, and his voice held a note of disbelief. "That should not be possible." Marcus looked at the queen and saw something shift in her ancient eyes. "How long have they been with you?" she asked. 2.5 weeks. "And in that time, what have you done?" Marcus felt heat rise in his face because he knew how this would sound. "I kept them warm against my chest because they needed constant body heat and a steady heartbeat to stay stable. And I fed them the nutrient paste your medical database recommended, and I held them when they were scared. And I sang to them when they couldn't sleep, and I made sure they knew they were safe." The silence that followed was so complete Marcus could hear his own heartbeat. "You," the queen said slowly, "you nursed our daughters as if they were your own offspring. I did what they needed in our culture." One of the advisors said, "Royal larvae bond only with their birth mother and sometimes their primary nursery attendants, but never with outsiders, and certainly never with another species." Pip had successfully climbed to Marcus's shoulder now and was rubbing her small head against his neck while making content chirping sound. Squeak had given up trying to cling to his shirt and had instead wrapped herself around his arm. The queen rose from her throne and descended the platform, and as she approached, Marcus had to fight the urge to step back because she was terrifying up close. She stopped just in front of him and extended one massive appendage toward her daughter's. Pip looked at her mother and then back at Marcus and made a questioning chirp. "It's okay," Marcus said softly. "That's your mama and she loves you very much and you're safe with her." Slowly, carefully, Pip reached out and touched her mother's extended appendage. The queen made a sound that the translator couldn't interpret, but Marcus didn't need translation because he recognized the sound of a mother reuniting with her lost child in any language. Squeak was more reluctant, but eventually she too reached toward the queen while still keeping a grip on Marcus's arm. "They remember us," the queen said, and her voice was thick with emotion, "but they trust you more. They've been with me during a critical bonding period," Marcus explained, "but you're their mother, and that bond is stronger than anything I could create in 2 weeks." The queen's eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made his breath catch. "You truly believe that?" "I know that." One of the court advisors suddenly spoke up in rapid Zitharian that the translator struggled with, but Marcus caught words like dishonor and execution and contamination. The queen's response was sharp enough to make the advisor flinch. "What did he say?" Marcus asked. "He said that you have touched royal offspring and that the punishment for such dishonor is death." The queen replied, "He said that you should be executed immediately, regardless of your intentions." Marcus felt his stomach drop, but he kept his voice steady. "And what do you say?" The queen looked at her daughters, who were now trying to stretch between her and Marcus as if they could somehow stay connected to both. "We say," she began, that you have done something we did not think possible and you have created a problem we do not know how to solve because our daughters should not trust you and they should not bond with you, but they have, and breaking that bond now would damage them. So what happens now? The queen was quiet for a long moment. Now you must stay with them until they are fully weaned and stable enough to separate from you without trauma. Marcus blinked. Stay as in here on your ship? You will remain as their nurse guardian until such time as they no longer require your presence. The queen said, "This is not a request." Living aboard a Zitharian royal vessel was like existing in a fever dream, and Marcus Webb spent his first 3 days convinced. He would wake up back on the Wayfarer and discover this had all been some kind of stress-induced hallucination brought on by too much recycled coffee and not enough sleep. But no, this was real, and he really was residing in guest quarters that were 3 times the size of his entire cabin back home, and he really was spending his days caring for 2 alien princesses who thought he was their secondary parent figure. The Queen had assigned him a translator unit that was far superior to anything human technology had produced, and it rendered Zitharian speech into comprehensible English almost instantaneously, which was helpful because he was having a lot of conversations he never expected to have. The larvae require elevated calcium levels in their next feeding. The head nursery attendant informed him on day 4 while watching with barely concealed horror. As Marcus cradled Pippin's squeak against his chest, "You must ensure proper mineral balance." "Understood," Marcus said. "Is there a specific ratio I should follow?" The attendant provided detailed instructions while radiating disapproval so intense. Marcus could practically feel it, and he was starting to understand that his presence here was causing massive cultural friction. The problem was that Zitharian society was built on rigid hierarchies and strict protocols, and the idea of a human male caring for royal offspring violated approximately 17 different cultural taboos that he was just starting to learn about. But the Queen had commanded it, and in their own culture, the Queen's word was absolute, so everyone had to tolerate his presence, even if they hated every second of it. Pip chirped happily from his shoulder, where she'd taken the perching whenever he walked through the ship, and other Zitharians would stop and stare, because apparently royal larvae didn't perch on people like parrots. "You're going to get me killed," Marcus told her, but she just rubbed her head against his neck in response. The Queen summoned him on the evening of his 5th day aboard, and he found her in a private chamber that was less formal than the throne room, but somehow more intimidating because it was personal. "Sit," she commanded, and gestured to a platform that had been modified for human proportions. Marcus sat carefully with Pippin's squeak still attached to him because separating from them for more than a few minutes still caused distress responses. "We have questions," the Queen said. "I'll answer what I can. Why did you save our daughters?" Marcus had expected accusations or demands, but not this direct question about motivations. And he took a moment to gather his thoughts. "Because they needed help," he said finally. "Because I heard their distress signal, and I found them dying, and I couldn't just leave them there. But they were not your species and not your responsibility. Does that matter?" Marcus asked. "They were children, and they were in danger, so I helped them because that's what you're supposed to do." The Queen's mandibles clicked in a pattern he was learning meant thoughtfulness. "In our culture, responsibility is clearly defined by bloodline and hive affiliation, and we do not extend care beyond those boundaries without specific political or strategic reasons. In human culture," Marcus said slowly, "we have a concept called compassion that sometimes transcends those boundaries, and we believe that protecting the vulnerable is a basic moral obligation, regardless of who they are, even when it brings you no benefit. Especially then." The Queen was quiet for a long time, watching her daughters, who were now dozing peacefully against Marcus's chest. "Our species have been enemies for generations," she said. "We have fought border skirmishes and engaged in Cold War tactics, and we have taught our young that humans are dangerous individualists who cannot be trusted because you have no loyalty to collective good. And we've been taught that Zitharians are rigid hierarchical zealots who value order over individual life. Marcus replied, "Turns out stereotypes are complicated. You speak with surprising boldness for someone at our mercy. Respectfully, your majesty, if you wanted me dead, I'd already be dead," Marcus said. "So either you're planning something elaborate or you're actually trying to understand what happened here." The queen's eyes glittered with something that might have been amusement. "You are not what we expected from a human. You're not what I expected from a Zitharian queen either." They talked late into the night cycle, and Marcus learned that the attack on the royal transport had come from a radical faction within Zitharian society that opposed the Queen's relatively moderate policies toward other species. "They took our daughters to hurt us and to prove that our openness to outside contact made us weak," the Queen explained. "When the transport was destroyed, we assumed our daughters died with it. But someone put them in stasis," Marcus said. "Our personal guard captain," the Queen confirmed. "She activated the pods and sent the distress beacon before the ship was overrun. And she died protecting our children's last chance at survival." Marcus felt a lump in his throat because he'd been focused on saving the larvae and hadn't really thought about who had saved them first. "She was a hero." "She was," the Queen agreed. "And now you are too, even though you do not wish to be." Over the following weeks, Marcus fell into a strained routine where he cared for Pip and Squeak while navigating the complex social dynamics of a Zitharian royal court that wasn't sure whether to honor him or execute him. The larvae grew rapidly, and with growth came increased mobility and curiosity, which meant Marcus spent a lot of time chasing Pip through corridors while Squeak clung to his back and chirped encouragement. He also spent time talking with the Queen because she seemed genuinely curious about human culture and perspectives in a way that went beyond political intelligence gathering. "Tell us about human family structures," she asked one day. Marcus explained concepts like adoption and family and the human tendency to form bonds based on choice rather than just biology. "So humans will claim non-genetic offspring as their own?" "All the time," Marcus said. "Love and family aren't always about DNA." The Queen processed this. "Among our kind, genetic lineage is everything, and the idea of choosing family outside bloodlines is almost incomprehensible. Maybe that's something worth reconsidering." He didn't realize how dangerous a statement that was until 3 nights later, when assassins came for him. Marcus woke to the sound of his door being forced open, and he had just enough time to roll out of his sleeping platform with Pip and Squeak before the first attacker lunged. The assassin was a Zitharian warrior and fast and deadly, but Marcus had spent years in the merchant fleet, including time in some very rough ports, so he knew how to fight. He dodged the first strike and grabbed a piece of furniture to use as a shield while backing toward the emergency comm panel. "Guards!" he shouted. "Intruders in guest quarters." The assassin didn't speak, just came at him again with bladed appendages that could have split him in half. Then Pip and Squeak did something unexpected. They attacked the larvae. Were small and not fully developed, but they had sharp mandibles and surprising strength, and more importantly, they were absolutely furious that someone was threatening their nest friend. Pip launched herself at the assassin's face while Squeak bit down hard on one of the attacker's legs, and the combination was enough to throw the warrior off balance. Marcus used the opening to hit the comm panel and then grabbed the heavy decorative urn that the Queen had placed in his quarters and brought it down on the assassin's head with all his strength. The Zitharian went down hard just as royal guards burst through the door. What followed was chaos as more assassins were discovered throughout the ship and a full security lockdown was implemented. Marcus sat in a secure room with Pip and Squeak, who refused to leave his arms while medics checked him for injuries. The Queen arrived within minutes, and her fury was a terrible thing to witness. Who dared? She demanded. The head of security looked uncomfortable. It was Advisor Clef and his faction, Your Majesty, and they attempted to kill the human to prevent what they called contamination of the royal bloodline. Contamination, the Queen repeated, and her voice could have frozen suns. They call our daughters. Survival contamination? They fear that the larvae's attachment to the human will weaken them and make them sympathetic to other species. The security chief explained. They see it as a threat to Zetharian purity. The Queen looked at Marcus, who was still catching his breath. Are you harmed? Bruised but alive, Marcus said. Your daughters are fine too, though they're a bit worked up. They defended you. Yeah, they did, Marcus said with wonder. I didn't know they could move that fast. The Queen approached and gently touched her daughters, who chirped at her before burrowing back against Marcus. Our daughters marked you with their protective pheromones, she said quietly. Do you understand what that means? Not really. It means they have claimed you as part of their nest family, and they will defend you as they would defend us, the Queen explained. This is unprecedented. One of the court officials, who survived the purge of conspirators, spoke up nervously. Your Majesty. This proves the danger, and the human's influence is changing the natural order. No, the Queen said firmly. This proves that our natural order has been too narrow. She turned to address the entire assembled court. We have spent generations teaching our young that outsiders are threats and that loyalty exists only within bloodlines, and look where it has brought us. The title of Nest Friend came with responsibilities that Marcus Webb hadn't fully understood when he accepted it, and chief among those responsibilities was apparently attending formal court sessions, where he had to stand beside the Queen while various Zetharian dignitaries argued about policy and trade agreements and things that made his head hurt. Pip had grown bold enough to perch on the Queen's throne arm during these sessions, while Squeak preferred to wrap herself around Marcus's shoulders like a living scarf, and together the four of them presented an image that was being transmitted across both Zetharian and human space. The political fallout was predictable. Human authorities demanded his immediate return and insisted that holding a human citizen aboard an alien vessel was tantamount to kidnapping, while hardline Zetharian factions called for his execution as a corrupter of royal purity. The Queen ignored both sides. Let them shout, she told Marcus during one of their private evening conversations. Words without understanding are just noise. Marcus had been aboard the royal ship for 2 months now, and Pip and Squeak had grown from helpless larvae into juveniles, who were mobile and curious and constantly getting into trouble. Pip had discovered the ship's environmental controls and had managed to increase the humidity in 3 different sectors before she was caught, while Squeak had somehow accessed the food storage and eaten of preserved nutrients to make herself sick. They're like toddlers, Marcus complained to Jack during one of his weekly check-ins with the Wayfarer. Smart, destructive toddlers with mandibles. How much longer are you staying? Jack asked. Marcus looked at where the juveniles were currently attempting to build some kind of nest structure out of his spare clothing. Until they don't need me anymore, I guess. But it was becoming clear that the situation was evolving beyond simple childcare. The Queen had started asking Marcus to attend strategy meetings, and his perspective as an outsider who understood both human and Zetharian thinking was proving valuable. The humans want to establish a trading post in the neutral zone, one advisor reported during a council session. But we suspect this is cover for military expansion. Or, Marcus suggested, they actually just want to trade because the neutral zone has resources both species need, and establishing commerce is cheaper than fighting. The advisor's mandibles clicked skeptically. Humans are not to be trusted. Neither are Zetharians according to human media, Marcus replied. But here I am trusting the Queen with my life every single day, and so far I'm still breathing. The Queen's eyes glittered. What would you propose, Nest Friend? Marcus took a breath because he'd been thinking about this for weeks. What if we tested trust on a small scale before jumping to large political agreements? Explain. What if we created a joint colony, Marcus said slowly. Just one small settlement where human and Zitharian families could live together and raise their children side by side. The silence that followed was so complete, Marcus could hear Pip's quiet breathing from where she dozed on her mother's throne. You suggest we mix our young with human young, an advisor said with horror. I suggest we let our children learn that the other species isn't automatically an enemy, Marcus replied, because Pip and Squeak have learned that humans aren't threats, and I've learned that Zitharians aren't the rigid, heartless collective that human propaganda suggests. And if it fails? Another advisor asked. Then we'll have learned something valuable about where the real barriers are, Marcus said. But what if it doesn't fail? What if we discover that most of the hatred between our species is just inherited fear and not based on any real incompatibility? The Queen was quiet for a long time. This would require approval from human authorities as well. Leave that to me, Marcus said with more confidence than he felt. The proposal worked its way through both human and Zitharian bureaucratic channels and met resistance at every level. But Marcus had an advantage that no diplomat could match. He had Pip and Squeak. When human officials demanded video conferences to discuss the proposal, Marcus made sure the juveniles were present and visible because it was hard to maintain species hatred when you were watching two young Zitharians playfully wrestling with a human while chirping happily. Captain Webb, the human diplomatic liaison, said during one such conference, "Do you truly believe this colony concept is viable? I believe that if we don't try something different, we're going to end up in a war that neither species can afford," Marcus replied while Squeak investigated his cum unit with fascinated mandible clicks. "And I believe our children deserve better than inheriting our conflicts." The liaison watched Squeak for a moment. "Those juveniles trust you completely." "They do. And their mother trusts you with them." "She does." The liaison sighed. "I'll bring your proposal to the council, but I can't promise anything." 3 months after Marcus had first stepped aboard the Zithorian, royal vessel word came that both governments had approved a pilot program for a joint colony. The colony would be established on a neutral world and would house 20 human families and 20 Zitharian families with full support infrastructure. Provided by both governments, Marcus was appointed as human coordinator with a Zitharian counterpart named Shelthra, who regarded him with deep suspicion. "This will fail," Shelthra told him bluntly during their first planning meeting. "Our species are too different." "Maybe," Marcus agreed. "But we won't know unless we try." Pip and Squeak were now adolescents and capable of short-term separation from Marcus, without distress, which meant he could return to human space for the first time in months. The Queen summoned him the night before his departure. "Our daughters wish to accompany you," she said. Without preamble, Marcus blinked. "To human space?" "They insist," the Queen said. "They say they wish to see your world and meet your people, and they say they will learn better if they experience both cultures." "That's actually not a bad idea," Marcus admitted. "But are you comfortable with them leaving?" The Queen's mandibles clicked in. What he'd learned was her version of a rueful smile. "We are not comfortable, but we recognize that our discomfort is based on old fears, and you have taught us that such fears can be overcome. I'll protect them with my life." "We know," the Queen said. "That is why we are allowing this." She paused. "You have changed us, Nest friend, and you have changed our daughters, and perhaps you have changed the future of our species. I just did what felt right." "Yes," the Queen agreed. "And that is precisely the point." The arrival of Marcus Webb back in human space, accompanied by 2 Zitharian adolescent royals, caused a media sensation that made his head spin. News services from across human territory wanted interviews, and human children wanted to meet the alien princesses, and Pip and Squeak handled it all with surprising grace. Your world is very loud, Pip observed while they navigated a crowded spaceport. You get used to it, Marcus assured her. The colony inauguration took place 3 weeks later, and Marcus stood on the platform watching as human and Zetharian families arrived with their children and their belongings and their hopes for something better. Pip and Squeak stood on either side of him while the Queen watched via holographic transmission and gave the opening address. We gather here today to attempt something unprecedented, the Queen said, to build a community not on shared genetics or shared culture, but on shared belief that our children deserve peace. The human representative gave a similar speech, and then it was Marcus's turn. I'm not a politician or a diplomat, he began. I'm just a salvage captain who made a choice to help 2 children who needed it. And that choice has brought me here. He looked at the families assembled before him. All of you are making a choice. 2, and you're choosing to trust that the species we've been taught to fear might actually be worth knowing, and your children are going to grow up knowing something we never did, which is that differences don't have to mean conflict, Pip chirped softly, and he smiled. I've watched these 2 learn and grow, and they're not so different from human children in the ways that matter because they're curious and playful and affectionate, and they want to feel safe and loved. If we can remember that every Zetharian and every human is someone's child, then maybe we can build something here that's stronger than our old hatreds. The response was cautious but hopeful, and over the following weeks, Marcus watched something remarkable happen. Human children and Zetharian juveniles played together, and initially they were hesitant and uncertain, but curiosity won out. Soon they were teaching each other games and sharing food and learning each other's languages. The adults took longer because adults carried more baggage, but Marcus saw human parents teaching Zetharian parents about human developmental stages and Zetharian parents showing humans their traditional nursery songs. There were problems, of course, because culture clashes were inevitable, and there were moments when Marcus wondered if Shelfra had been right about the whole thing being doomed to fail, but then he'd see a human toddler sharing her toys with a Zetharian larva, or watch a Zetharian parent comforting a crying human child, and he'd remember why they were doing this. 6 months into the colony experiment, a young human boy fell into a river, and it was a Zetharian juvenile who jumped in to save him despite Zetharian's natural fear of deep water had succeeded. Came Durin,